Welcome to another episode of this podcast. I am Thando, and you are listening to Unpack It with Thando, a space where we empower one another through the wisdom of everyday circumstances. So welcome to my space. On today's episode, I will be talking about the importance of forgiveness. First and foremost, it is very important to remember that forgiveness does not mean forgetting, because sometimes forgetting will cost you so much. It will cost you your boundaries, your peace, and your mental health. Therefore, it is true that you can forgive, but not forget. And I actually think it is very important that you do not forget, just so that you keep protecting your boundaries, you keep protecting your peace and your mental health. So before I go any further, I'd like to read a quote from A Course in Miracles. It goes like this: what could you want that forgiveness cannot give? Do you want peace? Forgiveness offers it. Do you want happiness? A quiet mind, a certainty of purpose, and a sense of worth and beauty that transcends the world? Do you want care and safety and warmth of sure protection always? Do you want a quietness that cannot be disturbed, a gentleness that cannot be hurt, a deep, abiding comfort, and a rest so perfect it cannot be upset? All this forgiveness offers you. You who want peace can find it only by complete forgiveness. And so I started to look into forgiveness for my own self, for my own journey in the beginning of this year, because I could just tell that God was moving me towards a new path, one that was going to require the healthiest version of myself. That was when I started to let go of many things that didn't work for me. Those things being some relationships, certain habits and attachments I had at the time. Now, as I started this journey of forgiveness, God emphasized to me the need to forgive myself. Because deep down, I was hard on myself for all the things I thought by now I should have heard, the perfect life, the perfect friendships or relationships. So God somehow knew that if I don't forgive myself, I will always be a victim to other people's judgment of me. But if I've already dealt with that inside of me, then other people's opinions and judgments won't have much power over me. I believe this was God fully equipping me for what was to come in my life. And so, because not so long after that, I realized that there was a shift, and I saw progress in many of the projects that I was doing, simply because I chose to let go of the anger that I was harboring even against myself. And so I remember that I felt sort of a spiritual boost just in that moment when I was contemplating forgiveness. I felt like I was spiritually uplifted because now I was open and I was ready to receive whatever it was that God was to give to me so that I can move forward on my path. The Word of God tells us to seek and we shall find. All along, I was seeking for peace, and I happened to stumble upon it through forgiveness. After forgiving myself, God urged me to open myself up so that I can forgive my parents. So this one was a hard one for me because for the longest time I didn't want to admit it to myself that I had a parental wound, that there was a hole and a space in me that was supposed to have been filled by both my mother and father. I didn't admit it to myself because I didn't want to look like a person who is ungrateful to my family and my grandmother who were there for me. So oftentimes when you admit such things and maybe you vocalize your pain or whatever, you have no control of what the other people will interpret it or how they will interpret it. And so because I was young, I didn't have the ability to even be able to communicate to my family as to how I felt. about the separation between me and my parents. And so it was just something that I suppressed so much inside of me. However, the truth is that child and parental separation is traumatic. It is a traumatic thing, no matter the situation or circumstances that caused separation. So it is the lack of such knowledge that makes us to hold back and repress such things until we are able to look at that anger and pain without judgment of any sort. It will always be there, and it will always grow inside of us. Anything that we repress will always push itself up to come so that you can acknowledge it and so that you can work on it. So before even forgiving anyone, I deeply needed to know that I was angry and I had a valid reason for that anger. I needed to see and feel the sadness inside of me. I remember the period last year when I was still at res, and I had spent an entire week crying nonstop without really knowing why I was crying. It was just, I just had this anger and sadness that just needed to be released through my tears. It is only now that I realized that it was the inner child in me who was crying at the time. The one who never cried over the absence of both her parents, simply because she was too young to understand the impact of their absence. And what's funny is that before I never even knew that you could grieve for somebody who's still alive. But now I realize that at that time last year, I was going through a very postponed or delayed grieving process for the absence of both my parents. It now makes sense because the reason why we grieve is because we have lost someone, something significant to us. One whose place will remain open and empty for a long time until we learn to live with that emptiness and void, until we heal that void, until we acknowledge that it is there. Mind you, I've been so blessed with such a support system, that being my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles. But even with all of that, I still needed to grieve so that I can let go and move towards healing and freedom. As I'm connecting the dots now, it becomes clear to me that one major thing that triggered my mental breakdown last year was actually seeing my dad at a family funeral in March last year. I did not expect to see him, and even when I saw him, I was not angry, I was not happy, nothing out of the ordinary happened. But a week after that, that is when I started the non-stop crying. I couldn't associate it with anything per se at the time. I was just blank, but also I just could feel this anger and sadness and void and loneliness sort of a thing at the time, in such a way that I could feel that the only thing I needed to do was cry. And I did just that. I got to see that sometimes even those things that you repress, thinking that you don't have time for them, thinking they are not important, at a certain point in your life they will come back and they will stop you at your tracks as you are busy moving forward and doing things. They are capable of stopping you, so that you realize them, so that you acknowledge them, and you heal them if they need healing, you release them if they need releasing. And so that was the moment where I learned that. I also believe that when we don't forgive others, we are setting ourselves up to disobey God, especially if you are a person who is a believer in God and you are a person who desires to be used by God as a vessel in any way, shape or form, because there's no limit at what God can do. You really need to forgive, because how will you fully function in the will of God if you are holding resentment against certain people in your heart? What happens if God tells you to partner with those people for the advancement of His work? What chances do you guarantee us that you will do what God tells you to do? Let's say God tells you to go and partner with that person you have anger against, that person who did you wrong at a certain time. What happens then? Will you even go there? What happens when God tells you to go and serve that person in any area? Will you do it? So when you do not forgive, you are indirectly also asking God to not forgive you too. Because as we know, God is a God who is a loving Father and is a forgiving Father. And I think He expects also we forgive just as we are His children. And so the worst thing you could ever do to yourself is to not forgive. Hence, when you forgive, you aren't necessarily doing it for the other person, but for yourself, for your own advancement, for your own healing, for your own peace. You are opening a door for God's forgiveness to also enter into your life. You are investing in yourself, just in case you need God's forgiveness in the future. When you are not forgiving, also you are standing in a chance of limiting God's work through your own life. It is almost guaranteed that should you be blessed by God with anything, you will never freely share your blessings with those people whom you have not forgiven. And that limits the work of God. Because God is a God who forgives. And as a loving Father, He wants the best for all of us. Not some of us, but all of us. He expects us to forgive one another too. We need to start seeing forgiveness as a very necessary self-care routine, an investment that we make for our own advancement. And I understand that forgiving is not an easy thing. The truth is that anger and resentment, even though they stand for a reason, even though they are there for a reason, they are also exhausting. Unforgiveness is exhausting. It is like a consuming fire inside you that is continuously burning. Therefore, when you decide to forgive, you are actually pouring water into that fire. And ultimately, forgiveness becomes your relief. I often sometimes feel like forgiveness should be a health prescription. Because once you start forgiving and letting go of heavy things in your life, you start feeling healthier than before. Simply because you have space inside of you to actually enjoy life, to actually take in love, to actually take in the beautiful things in life. So the anger, all those negative emotions, they are standing on the way of those positive emotions that you desire the most. So it will take you having the courage to release those angers, release that pain, so that you can now welcome the lighter things into your life. At a certain point, I was even reminded of the story in the Bible where Moses saw a burning bush and God said to him, "Before you can come near, you need to take off your shoes, because now you are approaching a holy ground." I just imagine Moses being confused as to why the taking off of his shoes required before standing on a holy ground. I mean, those shoes were a protection to his feet from the sharp stones and many other things on the ground. In other words, they had a purpose. They were protection. But somehow, in this moment, they were not required. In fact, they might have even hindered him from moving forward into the holy ground that God was calling him towards. I also see forgiveness like that. Even though it is a valid and it has purpose, there comes a time where God requires you to take it off so that you can begin to move towards greater heights according to His will for your life. It's very important to emphasize that in order for you to forgive, you do not need to really have an apology from someone else just before you can forgive. Because chances are that that person might still be denying the fact that they did you wrong. They might not even be aware that there's something they did to you that has caused a wound inside of you. And so forgiveness is self-work. You work on yourself, and some even receive an apology. But it is very necessary that not to depend on an apology before you can actually give forgiveness. And also, even when you don't receive an apology from someone, I think that it could be even a blessing. Because the reality is that there are people out there who are so good at dismissing other people's feelings and experiences, in such that they might even make you feel like you are hallucinating by even saying that they need to forgive you, or even sharing your experience and telling them what they did to you or how you felt when they did this to you. They might make you start now thinking that there was never anything there. And so it is very important that you become comfortable with just acknowledging your own wounds and then releasing them and releasing the people. In most cases, when you decide to forgive, you will just have to offer the forgiveness without any proper communication with the other person, without inviting them back to your safe space or your life. You will just have to make peace with the situation and slowly but surely move on with your life. And I think in most cases that is the best way to do it, because you have no power over how the other person may respond. They might project, they might even wound you more. And so take forgiveness as something that you are doing for yourself, and you can even do it by yourself in your own comfortable space. Just introspect, see those wounds, acknowledge them, see the anger, acknowledge the anger, and then at the right time when you feel comfortable, release it. It is your own journey, just as it's still my own journey. I am not perfect in it, and I'm still really walking the journey and figuring everything out. But I have seen that it is very beneficial for my journey. It is beneficial for me, even as a person. So until the next episode, I hope you found something valuable from this episode. And please don't feel pressurized to do anything, because we all are on our own different journeys. So take your time in whatever, and keep on seeking answers to your questions. Keep on learning your lessons, and make sure you keep on growing.